Welcome to the ExecMBA podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with my admissions colleague, Zoe Mayfield-Boykin. It's a new admissions cycle, and Zoe joined us to discuss the launch of our applications for the Executive MBA and Part-Time MBA classes enrolling August 2027. If you're planning to apply to one of our professional degree programs, either Executive MBA or Part-Time MBA, in the coming cycle, this episode is essential listening. And as always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to the ExecMBA podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with my admissions colleague, Zoe Mayfield-Boykin. Zoe, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Fred. It's great to be back.
It's great to talk with you. Here we are on the precipice of another admissions cycle. How are you feeling? How's everything?
Feeling great. It's always a little bittersweet. We say goodbye to a class that we've been with for about 11. We've been recruiting for about 11 months, but it's exciting because we get to say hello to a new class and new prospective students.
Yeah, this is a very dynamic time of year, right? We're about to welcome our newest class of Executive MBA, Part-Time MBA, Full-Time MBA students, as well as MSBA students the next few days. And we're getting ready to launch the application for the classes that will enroll, next August 2027, which sounds very far away, but it will be here before you know it. So yes, it's a great time of year. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, I believe is how it goes. So where do you want to start in this conversation? What's on your mind?
Yeah, I think I want to dive right in and just chat about what folks can expect that's new this year for executive and part-time MBA applications.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, we look at the application every year for both of these programs. We had some big news last year for Part-Time MBA, for example. We moved to test optional. We've been test optional for at least one cycle for Executive MBA. We made that announcement for Part-Time MBA. That was probably the biggest announcement last year. And we've gone through this cycle. And I don't know about you, Zoe, but I feel like we've hit on an application that works really well for these populations. When you work with working professional students, of course, Executive MBA and Part-Time MBA, both working professional programs, you're trying to find an application structure that gives people enough opportunity to share who they are and really offers insight. And we encourage folks to think about the application itself as their initial introduction to the admissions committee and giving us a chance to get to know them. But you're also trying to walk a fine line of not making it so onerous that it's really hard to do while you have all the other things in your life going on and a job and all of this. So, I feel like we've hit on a pretty good structure. And, so we don't have a lot of big updates to share this year. The essay questions that we asked last year or the essay questions that we plan to ask this year, the short answers is a way to think about it. It's 200-word responses. We tweak some things within the application in terms of instructions and kind of small updates that we think are make for an overall better experience for the applicant. But in terms of the substance of the application, no real changes. And that feels okay to me. How's it feel to you?
It feels great. I think it's also very helpful for folks who've been following us for a while, people who, maybe opened an application last year. You can became familiar with said application. You can rest assured that things will look the same this year for the most part. And we hope to see that application that you've been thinking about.
Yeah, and we know that's the case for our professional degree students. People oftentimes will think about taking this step for a few years before actually moving forward with an application. So if you're in that boat and you've been following our application process, some high level things that we'll get into here. So the first thing that's probably worth talking about is we are test optional for both Executive MBA and Part-Time MBA. I mentioned that we introduced that for Part-Time MBA last year. We're continuing that this year for both these programs. How do you encourage folks to think about this? Obviously, there's a decision there, right? So
Sure.
a test is not required to apply for either of these programs. However, you could provide a test score. How do you encourage candidates to think about that decision?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you have to take stock first of what is in your application. And so when we think about an application, we're first considering, the academics. How are you going to be able to thrive in a rigorous business program? And we do that by looking at transcripts, undergraduate transcripts, the coursework taken in your undergrad, coursework and transcripts from a graduate program if you hold another graduate degree. And sometimes a test score can be helpful in evaluating that piece of the puzzle too. Sometimes what I encourage people to think about when submitting or not submitting a test score is this additional data point going to be helpful in making the case that I am academically ready and I will thrive in a rigorous business setting? And so I always encourage folks first to take stock of what's in the application, what they have, what they're presenting, and make a decision of, do I feel like I can make the case for academic readiness without the score? If not, then maybe submitting a test score makes a lot of sense. We accept many different types of test scores. We accept the GMAT, the GRE, GMAT Focus, the LSAT, the MCAT, and then the executive assessment. My best advice is, if you're somebody thinking about taking a test score, or taking a test, to pursue the executive assessment. It is a test designed for working professionals, about 20 hours or so of preparation. And we are test agnostic, meaning we look at all test scores the same as an additional data point in your application.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Since going test optional, we certainly see more people applying without a test score than applying with a test score. Typical, for executive MBA or part-time MBA, look at the students who are admitted to the program. I would say somewhere in the neighborhood about maybe 15 to 20% of the students will have applied with a test score. And so one way you might think about that is, oh, well, I mean, maybe I shouldn't apply with a test score. Well, again, to Zoe's point, it's a very individual choice. And at the end of the day, when we talk about these things, we give you a framework for how to think about this. Like, to Zoe's point, you want to do this audit, you want to reflect about what's in your application. You think about, are you giving the admissions committee enough information to be able to make an informed decision that, yes, you can do the work that you're going to be asked to do here. And for some candidates, they'll feel like, you know what, I'm going to lean on my existing background. I feel like there's enough evidence there. And they're really going to have, they're really going to apply with that test score, and they're going to feel like, yep, still putting forward my best application. For other candidates, taking a standardized test may give them that peace of mind that, what, I've done everything I can. I've given the admissions committee as much as I can to consider as they think about my readiness for this experience. And so applying with a test score makes sense for someone in that camp. But that's how we encourage folks to think about it. And again, make the decision that is going to allow you to have that peace of mind when you press submit on your application. You feel like you're putting your best foot forward. So another part of the application that comes to mind when things people have questions about, at least, is the resume. Um, Find that a lot of people feel like they have to get their resume to one page. What advice do you give to candidates, Zoe, when you think about the resume?
Yeah, the resume, it's funny. Lots of people ask, what type of resume, what format of resume do we want to see as an admissions committee? And we are actually not sticklers for resume length or resume format. We want you to submit the resume that best represents who you are, the work that you've done, and the impact that you've made in the roles that you've held. So to do that, we often share that, best uh, rule of advice is 2 pages for every 10 years of professional experience. But again, not sticklers for length or format here at Darden. Again, it's a great opportunity for you to expand more on how you have impacted the organizations the organizations that you have worked for and the positions that you've held.
Yeah, there's two parts of your application that really speak to your professional experience. There's the job history section, which tends to be pretty surface level, kind of very basic information about what you've done, role, responsibility, direct report, salary, that kind of thing. But it doesn't tell us a lot about the impact that you made, the results you achieved. It doesn't really have that kind of depth to it. And so always encourage candidates to think about how the resume is working in tandem with the job history section of the application. The resume can also be a place, we talk about, wanting to get to know candidates, not just academically and professionally, but also personally. The resume can be a place where people can bring some of that personality as well. We have lots of areas of the application where someone's personality can come through, their personal interests can come through. Think about the short answer questions or essays. You also have, a whole area around activities, interests, community organization, kind of involvement. But there may still be things that candidates haven't been able to address that are important to them personally, that they would want the admissions committee to know about them. And the resume can be an opportunity to share more. This is, where you sort of mentioned that the resume is not necessarily a resume that you would use like at a networking fair just across a table as you're connecting with an employer. This is a resume that exists within your business school application, so it can look a little bit different, it can feel a little bit different because it's a different context. And so sort of think about this personal dimension. Sometimes people will share books that they're reading, podcasts that they listen to, countries they visited, other hobbies and interests that they have beyond the, you can character constraints in some of these fields, and you may have more that you want us to know about you. That can be an interesting use of the resume as well, something that you see from time to time. But you really want to be thinking sort of big picture here about the stories that you're telling through your application and how each element of the application, resume included, helps contribute to that overall picture or the narrative that you're telling. So when we think about the application, one of the things that's oftentimes on people's minds are the short answer questions or essays. I mentioned before, only 200-word responses, so short is the operative word here. We didn't change the questions year over year, but how do you encourage candidates to think about the short answer responses and how they fit into the overall application process?
Yeah, it's a great question because when we think about when we're considering and we are evaluating an applicant, we are looking at and beyond the academics, like we talked about, we are looking at the professional and the personal, and we want to understand professionally, what are your goals? How can we help you accomplish those goals? And then personally, what kind of classmate will you be? How will you show up on a learning team? How will you contribute to the classroom space and relate to the peers around you? And so the short answer questions are a fantastic place to expand upon that. An opportunity for you to tell us something that is not on tell us more about you, about something that's not on your resume. How you can go into detail about how you think about community. And then, of course, there's a career section and a career question that will ask about what your goals are. Because again, we are trying to understand this big picture, the academic of how you will do in a rigorous classroom, the personal, who you are, and how you'll show up in our community, and then of course professional, how we can help you get to where you need to go.
And it's fair to say the short answer questions are kind of one of the more personal elements of the application, right? Your personality, your voice can really come through, and always encourage candidates to consider this as kind of a two-way conversation. Like we pick these questions because they align with important community values here at Darden or aspects of the Darden experience, and we want people to have an opportunity to share experiences they have that align with those values. And there is no one right answer to the short answer questions. Many different approaches can work well. When you get down to sort of the application process, we'll consistently tell you it's a storytelling exercise. And so when you get the short answer questions, you want to think about how your responses are contributing to that overall story that you're telling through your application materials and sort of being intentional and strategic in that way. And so, rather than focusing on what you think we want to read or what we want to hear, think about what you want to share and how that can help, again, contribute to that overall narrative that you're advancing through your application materials. Because I always feel like it's a missed opportunity when you read someone's short answer response and it doesn't sound like them. It feels like they're trying to be sort of a typical MBA candidate or who they imagine to be a typical MBA candidate. Like this is a chance for us really to get to know you. And so authenticity is really the watchword here.
Exactly. I completely agree. When we get into a place where candidates are writing what they think we want to read, we lose their voice, we lose their authentic goals and how they show up in a community authentically. I think it's also worth noting when you mentioned this idea of a typical quote unquote MBA candidate, this is an opportunity for you to actually lead into your differences. This is for you to say, hey, this is how I bring something different to the classroom. And so when you get into a space of writing what you think you want us to hear, you lose that opportunity to share how you'll be different in the classroom.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up that point about typical MBA candidate because there is no typical candidate. And I know that sounds very cliche, but I think candidates often worry they don't have this or they don't have that, or they haven't taken this class or have this particular background, or they haven't had this kind of work experience. That is not a problem. When we look at someone's candidacy or reading their application, we're not comparing them to any sort of thing. We're trying to get to know them as them, and then thinking about who they're going to be in our community, what they're going to add to the classroom conversation. Because of course, Darden's case methods, participatory learning, and happens both in the classroom but also outside the classroom. Everybody has a learning team. So, what kind of teammate you're going to be, what kind of classmate you're going to be, and also what are your motivations around pursuing an MBA? Like, Darden is a place that really emphasizes the experience that you're going to have. To be in a case method environment, you have to want to be an active participant in your learning experience and bring that kind of energy. And so we're looking for people who are motivated and excited by that, who have that kind of curiosity and like to learn, but also want to be part of a community, right? So as you think about the description of all those things and what's always shared as well, you're not hearing us say, well, you need to have this background or this kind of experience. We're thinking a lot about motivations and kind of values and sort of your general orientation. towards others and sort of being an active participant in your experience. But there's so many different kinds of people who can be successful here. And that's really what makes the Darden learning environment interesting is when you can have, students in a classroom, all from different backgrounds, all different experiences, looking at the same case and bringing that perspective to those discussions.
Absolutely. And I think it is worth mentioning that with the case method, having as much difference as possible in that classroom is really what makes for a rich conversation. Folks coming from different perspectives, like you said, Brett, and different backgrounds, all attacking the same problem is a learning experience in itself, because you can see these different perspectives come to light as you are navigating whatever that challenge is or whatever that case is that's in the classroom.
Well, let's talk about the one part of the application the applicant is not going to fill out themselves, which is the recommendation. Now, the recommendation process in our application process completely electronic. We only require one recommendation. We will accept up to two. In case you're curious, most people will apply with just one recommendation. Why is that? Well, the recommendation process tends to be one of the slowest parts of the application process. You're asking a really busy person to take time to respond to a request for a recommendation from our team. And so to ask two people just ups the level of difficulty in terms of completing your application. And really all that's required is one. So most people will focus on one recommender. I mentioned it's electronic process. So the way that it works is once you put your recommender's information into your application, they would receive an email with a link to our recommendation materials. Make sure that they get that email. Sometimes it gets caught in spam folders and different things. If you find they didn't receive it, just reach out to us. We'll be happy to resend it to them. But I share that all of this as context. Like they don't have to write a letter for you. They certainly can, but it is really our recommendation materials consist of a ratings grid where they'll rate you across a number of dimensions and then three basic questions. Yeah. How do you know the applicant? How's the applicant compare to their peers? And what's one piece of constructive feedback you shared with the applicant? That I think is helpful to know as you're thinking about who could be a good recommender for you. So, how do you encourage people to think about recommender choice in the application process?
Sure. With recommendations and the recommender choice, first and foremost, the rule of thumb is you should choose somebody who knows you well. But based on the questions that we ask in our recommendation form, you can see how those questions might lend themselves to your supervisor, your current supervisor. We prefer a recommendation from a current supervisor. The reason being is this is a working professionals program. You will be working full time while completing your MBA. And we want to know that you have socialized this idea of going back to school with the folks at work, with the folks that approve your time off, that sort of thing. And so it really allows us to understand, A, have you had this conversation with your supervisor, which if you have not, I recommend having that conversation sooner rather than later. But B, again, that we get an understanding of how you show up in that team dynamic from a professional, someone who has seen you in a professional capacity.
Yeah, and if you think about the questions I mentioned on the recommendation form, that constructive feedback question is the one that really I think our team is particularly interested in. We're interested in all of it, but that is a question that we're really focused on. Because if you think about what the learning experience here at Darden is about, it's about you getting feedback, taking that feedback, and improving and ultimately thinking about, okay, well, how can I grow from this? It's the root of the experience here, and so we want to see how you've responded to feedback in the past and most often, colleagues, peers, friends, family members, neighbors. I'm trying to think of some of the people we've been asked about in the past. They don't give a lot of feedback, but managers, supervisors do, and that's just part of the relationship. And the other thing that the second question is one I've also thought a lot about is, how do you compare to peers? Some people at a similar role or similar level in an organization. Well, managers also oftentimes will have the best perspective on that too, because they'll have that 360-degree view of people who are in comparable roles. They'll kind of know what that looks like, and they'll be able to give more context regarding your performance. The recommendation is there's no particular way to assign to any part of our application. When we are reviewing someone's application, we're really looking at it as a whole. We're thinking about everything in the application to try to get to know the applicant as a person. But it's fair to say that the recommendation is really important in this process because it is the one part of the application where we're hearing from someone other than you, someone who's worked closely with you, that have given you feedback, coached you along the way, can really offer insight that we may not be getting from other elements of the application. And so, I think recommender choice is really, really important. Any other tips you would have around the recommendation process? So anything you would want people to think about?
It is the longest part of the application. It tends to be the longest part. So I recommend having, like I said, having that conversation sooner rather than later, because it is out of your control and it often takes, like I said, the longest in order to receive that recommendation to complete the application. The other piece is that you do not need to wait for your recommender to submit their portion. For you to submit your portion of the application. So the application and the recommendation are electronically linked, as you mentioned, Brett. And so once you are ready to submit your application, please feel free to do so. When your recommender completes their portion and is submitted, it will, like I said, automatically be linked. So don't feel like you need to wait for your recommender. You can go ahead and proceed forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip, and just stay in touch with your recommender as you
Yes.
go through the process. You find that recommenders are very deadline oriented, so make sure that they know your application deadline. Let's talk. We sort of talked about some of the key elements of the application, right? We talked about this sort of to apply with a test score or not. Again, being test optional, that is a decision for candidates. We talked about short answer questions. We talked about the resume and recommender choice. Another thing people might want to hear a little bit about is the interview process. Where do you start in just helping people, orient towards the Darden interview, which is maybe a little bit different from what they have in mind when they think about a business school interview?
Yeah, the interview, first and foremost, you should know that we do interview here at Darden. We interview by invitation only. And so you should see that if you are invited to an interview, you should see that as a positive step in direction. It's a positive step in the right direction for your application. But the interview itself, yes, it is a little bit different here at Darden. We interview anonymously, and our interviews are conversation based. So the person interviewing you will not have access to your application. They will not have read your application. Rather, they will just know your name and the time of the interview. And it is conversation based. So it's really your opportunity to share more about your application, your goals, how you show up in a community, your values, that sort of thing. We don't do so by asking a series of behavioral questions. It is a conversation, a back and forth with the person interviewing you. So that is a little bit different than maybe a traditional job interview itself.
Yeah, when people think about it's a 30, 35 minutes or so, you also have a little bit of time for questions that you have. I mean, when you think about how the interview fits into the overall application, so we talked about the application as sort of an initial introduction to who you are. It is very broad. We're asking for a lot of things. It tends to be maybe a mile wide, but an inch deep. It's hard to get too in depth about too much because you're just being asked for a lot. And it's also the case that you have limited real estate in the application, right? So you're having to make some choices around what do you want to make sure you convey? What do you want to make sure that the admissions committee knows about you after reading your application? So we always encourage candidates to kind of, as they're working through the application or even before they get started with the application, kind of think about their application priorities, what they want to make sure that they convey. But undoubtedly, that's not everything that they could potentially share. And so you have the application. If the way our process is structured, we read the application. If we think that there's a chance that the person could receive an offer of admission, that they're being considered for admission, then we would invite them to interview. And so the interview conversation with a member of our admissions committee, the interviewer will not have read your application, will not have a copy of your resume in front of them. And we think that's a very fair way to interview. That way the interviewer doesn't come with a lot of formed ideas about who the applicant is or their strength as a candidate. And they're there to listen to the candidate tell their story. Now there's a structure and a frame to the conversation, but it is also a chance for us to get a sense of some of those things that may be harder to judge from the application alone. How do you relate to other people? How do you share your story and communicate your ideas? All these things are important here at Darden as we're thinking about you as a classmate in the classroom environment, a teammate, all of that. But it's also a chance for you to bring real depth to your story, the story that you've begun to sort of sketch out through your application. So, the application tends to have a lot of what, whereas the interview can also focus on a lot of the why of your story. So, think about the things that are in the application, and hopefully this is making some sense. We will know where you went to college. We'll know where you worked. We'll know some of the things that you're interested in, how you spend your time outside of work. But we don't necessarily know why you chose that school or why you had moved from that company to the other company or chose that particular role. That why question is really where the interview can add depth to the application. And so when you're preparing for the interview, you really want to think about not just saying, well, here I did this and this and this. You want to bring us into your thought process. So not just where you went to college, but why did you choose that particular college? Were there other schools that you considered? How did you decide on your major? Was there a class or a particular experience that led you to choose that major? And then ultimately, as you start to think about your career, what were you thinking about? What paths did you consider? The more introspective and reflective you can be as you're telling the story, I think to me, Zoe, that's really what differentiates maybe kind of an average interview from a really like solid interview. A solid interview, they're going to do that introspection, they do that reflection. They're going to offer insight, not just the what, but also the why of their story.
I completely agree. And the other piece of advice I like to give candidates is that when telling your story doesn't necessarily begin after undergrad and into your professional career. You had an entire life that you lived prior to undergrad. Where are you from originally? And going back into that why that undergraduate institution? What are the things in your life, maybe prior to that time period in your life, that influenced your decision to pursue your current career, so on and so forth. So when we say we're interested in your story, we mean your story in its entirety, not just post undergrad and into your professional career.
Yeah, and again, you have limited time, right? You have 30, 35 minutes or so, and we generally ask folks in the first 5 to 10 minutes to walk us through their story, and that's typically your personal background, where you're from, those kinds of details, what you've done academically at this point, and what you've done professionally. So you're going to have to make some choices here about how much detail, but you want to avoid the situation where you've done that 5 to 10 minute summary in like 1 to 2 minutes, and then we have to ask a lot of questions, sort of go back and sort of pull out different insights. So some practice is probably helpful here too. I know we always think that we talk about ourselves a lot, and I know my story, that shouldn't be an issue, but it's a particular kind of storytelling to be able to say, this is what I did, but let me tell you a little bit about why I chose that particular thing. And here are the other things I considered. Like that's something that takes some practice and some skill with. So, we do these interviews via Zoom. I think that's important to note. We don't offer in-person opportunities. We found that when we offered in person and Zoom as a choice for candidates, people worried if they couldn't come in person that we would assume that they weren't that interested and just didn't want candidates to feel that kind of stress when they're already going through an application process, which we know can sometimes feel stressful to people as well. And so we only interview via Zoom. And so you want to make sure you're comfortable with the medium. I know we're all online these days. Zoom meetings are not uncommon at all, but like the interview via Zoom sometimes is a little bit of a different experience for candidates. So make sure that you've had some opportunity to practice as well with that. So you want to share a little bit about what happens after the interview, what we do as committee members once the conversation wraps up.
Sure. Yeah. So after the interview, the person interviewing you will write up the details of your conversation and it will be added to the candidate's admissions file. From there, the second reader will consider the application with the interview notes, and then it will move on to a final read where the reader will consider the first read, the second read, and then obviously the entire application itself and make a final decision. So that interview is a part of the application, and it is a important part of the application because again, it allows us to get the 10,000 foot view of who you are. Where you think about the application itself is 30,000 feet.
Yeah, I love the way that you put that there. And the way our process works, and then maybe this is a good time to talk about deadlines, is things
Sure.
do move really, really quickly. We offer multiple deadlines for candidates. We basically offer monthly deadlines. I think it's a way to describe it. Things start. Application launches in August, and first deadline right around the corner in September for part-time MBA. The first deadline will be September 1 for executive MBA. The first deadline will be September 10, and then basically monthly deadlines thereafter. How do you encourage candidates to think about how this process works? I know you're very much involved with helping us manage all the moving parts.
Yeah, so we have moved to monthly deadlines for part-time MBA. That is one of the things that is new this year. If you've been following us a while, you know that we had monthly deadlines in the fall last year and then a couple deadlines in the spring for part-time MBA. We will have monthly deadlines this cycle, the first of the month for part-time MBA. Executive MBA has had monthly deadlines, and we will continue with that at the 10th of the month. But we offer that many deadlines because we know that we are going to meet capable and qualified candidates that we would like to admit throughout. It takes us about 11 months to recruit a class for part-time MBA and executive MBA. And so we want to give folks plenty of opportunity to submit their application. I often get the question of which deadline should I submit my application in? And the answer is, it's the deadline that you feel like you have the strongest application that best represents you and the work that you have done and where you would like to go. That being said, there is more scholarship merit funding available in the earlier rounds. And so that's something to keep in mind. But again, really think about what is the deadline where I can have the strongest application at the time of submission.
Yeah, and I think if people know a little bit about the application process, what they typically know about is the full-time application process, which is really a lot of people applying basically at the same time. Now, professional degree application processes are very different. We offer deadlines starting in September until typically June, July, and so one way to interpret that, and you should interpret it this way, is that there's no one time when people apply to these programs. We meet great candidates in the fall, the winter, the spring, and even the summer months. So, you should take some comfort in that. If you're sort of thinking about this and you're saying, well, I'm still trying to figure this out. What if I'm not ready in the fall? And that's just fine. That's how our process works and how it's designed. And Zoe is absolutely correct that yes, we do have more scholarship money earlier in the cycle. We have a fixed budget, but we do manage the budget that we have with the expectation that we're going to meet candidates all throughout the year. And so this past cycle, we made scholarship awards for both part-time MBA and executive MBA into our very last rounds. And so know that as well. But if you want to have that peace of mind that you're applying at a time when we have more seats available, more scholarship money available, try to apply earlier if you can. But it's worth noting that early is a relative statement here because early for executive MBA, part-time MBA can be anytime from September until maybe even the winter. How do you think about early, Zoe? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I would say early is September, probably maybe until about February, March, and then we're kind of moving into the middle and end of our cycle. But yeah, early for us is a little bit longer than folks might assume.
Yeah, and I think it's worth thinking about this. And one of the things that we found to be the case, and sort of maybe wondering, well, why monthly deadlines now for part-time at PA two? We find that candidates really value having flexibility. People are busy while they're applying to these programs, a lot going on, and okay, you're targeting a deadline, but life happens, work happens, and there's something nice knowing that there's another opportunity to apply just a few weeks away, just coming up right around the corner. And so, if you're targeting September 1 as a part-time MBA applicant, and something comes up, well, October 1 is coming up, and if you're executive MBA applicant, you're looking at November 10. Well, guess what? December 10 will be right behind it if you need a little bit more time. Now, within the application process, things do move quickly, as I mentioned before. So it's what, about 2-3 weeks from application deadline to decision release, typically.
It is, yeah. So shortly after you submit an application, if we would like to move forward with an interview, we will be in touch. Our interview windows are made publicly available on our website, so you will know if you are going to be interviewed. You'll know kind of the range of dates in which we might reach out, and you could schedule an interview in that time. But yeah, it's about 3 weeks from application submission to decision release, and then candidates get about a month or 4 weeks to make a decision on their end if they're admitted to submit a deposit to accept our offer of admission.
Yeah, so things move quickly. So what we always encourage candidates to do is as you're working your way through the application process, after you press submit, continue doing research. Keep coming to things, keep learning about the program, because if you are extended an offer of admission, you will have about 3 to 4 weeks to finalize your decision. So we're here to help. We're obviously happy to support as we can, facilitate any kind of conversations, get you any information that would be needed. But find that if you can continue doing your research as you go along, that can really help as you kind of get into that decision making process if you do find yourself at that point. Well, Zoe, we talked a bit about sort of how to think about the application, the component parts of the application. We talked about deadlines. Anything else that's on your mind as you think about this year's cycle?
I think I wanted to piggyback off of your point about continuing to do your research. The application is not where your research ends. It's actually part of your research into a working professional program. So, once you submit an application, if you are invited for an interview, use that interview time to ask more questions that you can't find on the website. Use that time to leverage us as a resource. And like you said, Brett, continue to engage with us, continue to come to events because the research part definitely does not stop at the time of submission.
Yeah, I love the way that you put that because I mean, the application itself is just part of the discovery process. I think for many candidates, it's hard to think sort of abstractly about, do I want to do an MBA program when you don't really know if that's an option for you? And there's something about going through the application process, finding out. You learn a lot about each school as you go through the application process. What kind of questions they're asking? How's the application process structured? What's the interview like? The interview is an opportunity I mentioned to ask questions, but also we kind of structure the interview in a way that feels to us reflective of the culture of the school. As an admissions committee, we're trying to reflect that out. So there's so much information that you're gathering through this process. So you should absolutely still see the application as part of the research process rather than like the research phase and then like now I've made a decision. You really haven't made any decisions yet. You're still just discovering, you're still just finding things out. And I think I sometimes feel from candidates when we talk to them, they feel like, gosh, they're really making a commitment when they're applying. The reality is you're still doing your research.
Yeah, completely agree. And you should be. That's it's part of this process.
Well, Zoe, I'm so excited about this year. I know you've been spending a lot of time on, working on our event schedule, and we're gonna have a lot coming up on the website. What have been some of the things that you've been thinking about as you've been putting our events together?
Yeah, we're always thinking about, and what's top of mind for me is thinking about opportunities for students to engage with us in the classroom, coming to a tour. Also, opportunities for prospective students to engage with other parts of our community, so our career team and current students in particular. So. The events calendar is coming together. We have a robust slate of events that will be available on our website in the coming days here. And so I always encourage folks as part of that research topic on that topic that you should come to a class visit, come do a tour. It can be really helpful to see yourself in the space, see the students in the space, and really just get a sense of, does this feel like a good fit for me as a candidate?
Yeah, I mean, all schools kind of look the same when you read about them on the website. We're all going to talk about incredible faculty, the learning experience, your amazing classmates, the career outcomes that are possible. I think when students are making decisions, what I hear a lot from students is, I just came and I felt like I just really enjoyed the people. I felt like this is a place where I could really learn. I could really thrive. It's something that feels much more sort of I guess a little bit more about the sort of culture and sort of vibe or sort of just gut feel, the intuition that someone has when they come, which is, I mean, people try to make this decision super objective, but the reality is there's a lot of subjectivity to it. And
Yes.
just getting into the space and coming to a class visit, particularly since most people don't have experience with the case method, I think they're always curious about what that looks like. I think you get so much information when you do that.
Yeah, I think you'll find that it's very tangible when you come into the space, you come to a class visit. But also, I think you'll find that the case method is very accessible. A lot of folks are nervous about what that means, what it means to be evaluated based on contributions to a classroom space. And coming to a class visit, seeing it in play really puts it in perspective of like, oh, I could really see myself thriving in this classroom.
Yeah, and I think also it's my favorite class visits are when people come out of there and they're like, "That was so interesting. I wanted to participate." Right? These are just observations, but when people feel like, "Oh man, I actually learned something I could use at work," or I really wanted to add something to that conversation. And not to mention, you also get to spend some time with the current students too, and kind of pick their brains. And of course, they were in your position not so long ago. I think that really so much information in a relatively short period of time. I mean, these class visits are 2.5 hours or so. You get to learn a lot, and I think it does help make what can sometimes sound a little bit abstract to be much more concrete and sort of tangible. So it's great chatting with you as always, and excited to start a new application cycle. Looking forward to those first rounds in September.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
And that was my conversation with my admissions colleague, Zoe Manfield Boykin. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at exec, that's ExecMBA at darden.virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.